Marcus had driven through winter storms before, but nothing prepared him for the whiteout that swallowed the highway that night. The wind pushed against his truck like it was trying to flip it, and the temperature had dropped so sharply that even his breath felt heavy in his chest. He kept his hands tight on the wheel, barely able to see more than a few feet ahead, when suddenly a shadow lurched into his headlights. He hit the brakes, and his heart slammed against his ribs. A woman was stumbling across the iced-over road, clutching a small boy whose lips were turning the color of bruised ice. Two little girls dragged behind her, crying so hard their breaths broke into shivers. She looked terrified. Not just cold, but terrified, as if she expected someone else to come roaring out of the darkness behind her. When Marcus opened his door, she screamed at him not to come closer, her voice cracked from the cold and fear. But he stepped toward her anyway, raising his hands slowly, trying not to scare her more than she already was. He had seen freezing children before, but never a mother so desperate she looked ready to run straight back into the storm if he took one more step. His voice dropped and steadied as he whispered the only thing he could think to say, the line that stopped her shaking just long enough to meet his eyes. "Ma'am, if you don't come with me right now, your son won't survive the next 5 minutes." And yet, even as she hesitated, clutching her children tighter, she didn't know something that would change everything that followed. This stranger in the storm, the man begging her to trust him, was connected in a way she could never have imagined to the very nightmare she was running from. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus didn't waste another second once she stopped screaming. He ushered Evelyn Parker and her children into his truck, brushing snow off their coats as the wind hammered against them hard enough to knock Lily off balance. Evelyn grabbed her daughter's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened, and even inside the cab, where the heater struggled but still offered some warmth, her fear didn't ease. She sat stiffly, breathing in short, panicked bursts, her arms wrapped around Jake as if she was shielding him from the air itself. Jake, only 8 years old, lay limp against her chest, his head rolling slightly each time the truck hit a patch of ice. Lily and Rose, just 5, twins with red noses and trembling hands, curled together in the back seat, trying not to cry but failing each time another gust of wind rattled the doors. What struck Marcus most wasn't the cold, or the storm, or the silence of that abandoned road. It was Evelyn's eyes. She watched the mirrors more than the windshield, as if expecting someone to appear through the swirling snow at any second. Her voice wavered when she finally spoke, telling Marcus her name, but she didn't explain why she was out there in a storm that could kill a grown adult in minutes. Marcus introduced himself quietly, keeping his tone calm, the way he used to when he was an army medic comforting wounded soldiers. He didn't mention the tragedy that pushed him out of the service, the one that still woke him in the middle of the night. Nor did Evelyn ask. But the way she held her son, the way she couldn't stop shaking even after the warmth began returning to her fingers, told Marcus this wasn't just a family caught in a blizzard. The storm outside was brutal, the temperature falling faster than he'd ever seen, and no cars had passed them in nearly 20 minutes. That stretch of highway was practically forgotten in weather like this, and Marcus knew that if he hadn't come along when he did, Evelyn and her children would have been another story on the local news, one people shook their heads at, and then moved on. But as he watched Evelyn glance over her shoulder again, checking the darkness behind them with a fear that didn't belong to the storm, he realized something else. Her terror wasn't just about the cold. Whatever she was running from wasn't the weather. It was alive, it was close, and it wasn't finished. Evelyn's hesitation hadn't vanished once they were inside the truck. Even as the heater rattled to life, she kept one hand on the door handle like she might jump out if Marcus moved too suddenly. When he reached toward Jake to check the boy's breathing, she jerked back so hard the twins whimpered. The cold had sunk deep into Jake's skin, and Marcus could see the early signs of hypothermia, the slack jaw, the uneven breaths, the unfocused eyes. He told Evelyn he needed to help her son, but she shook her head rapidly, whispering that she didn't know him, didn't trust anyone, didn't want any strangers touching her children. Another icy gust cracked against the truck, and Jake's breath hitched, shallow and sharp, forcing Marcus to lean forward despite her protests. He spoke gently, explaining every movement as he rubbed warmth into the boy's arms and chest, trying to bring his circulation back before the child slipped into something they couldn't reverse on that lonely highway. Evelyn tried to pull Jake away again, panicking so hard her teeth chattered, but Marcus raised his voice just enough to break through her fear, telling her that if she took her son out of his hands now, the storm would finish what the cold had already started. The tension thickened when Jake's breathing worsened, each inhale cutting shorter than the last. Marcus recognized the danger immediately. He had seen it overseas, in mountains where frostbite struck faster than medics could move. He positioned Jake carefully and used emergency warming techniques he thought he'd never need again, cradling the boy close, sharing his own body heat, urging Evelyn to help him instead of fighting him. She trembled violently, torn between terror of what she feared behind them and fear of what was happening right in front of her. Marcus kept talking, steady and firm, telling her he wasn't trying to take her children. He wasn't trying to control anything. He was simply trying to keep Jake alive long enough for them to reach shelter. The twins crawled forward, their small hands gripping Marcus's sleeve as they watched their brother's chest rise and fall unevenly. The moment their fingers wrapped around him, Evelyn froze, confusion washing over her face as she realized her daughters weren't afraid of him. They were afraid of losing Jake. When her panic finally cracked into desperation, Marcus revealed why he knew what to do. He told her he had been an army medic, that he had treated dozens of cases just like Jake's, that he wouldn't let her son die on that forgotten strip of frozen highway. Evelyn stared at him, breath shaking, as if his words didn't match the image she had built in her mind. Slowly, almost painfully, she whispered an apology and helped him hold Jake the way he instructed. Minutes crawled by, heavy and uncertain, until Jake's breaths deepened just enough to give them hope. Only then did Evelyn's shoulders slump, her strength draining after hours of running, fear, and frost. She pressed her forehead to Jake's hair and let the truth slip out in a broken whisper Marcus wasn't expecting. She said they hadn't just gotten lost in the storm. They hadn't just been caught outside by accident. They had run because someone had sworn he would kill them before sunrise. Marcus felt the weight of her words settle over the cab like another layer of ice. But even then, Evelyn didn't tell him everything. The part she didn't say out loud, the part that lingered in her eyes, was what made Marcus's blood run cold. Marcus waited, giving Evelyn the space to breathe, but the storm outside rattled the truck like it wanted to shake the truth out of her faster. She held Jake tightly. The twins pressed against her sides, and for a long moment she seemed torn between staying silent and finally letting someone help carry the weight she'd been running with. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, as if the words scraped their way out of her throat. She said she hadn't planned to run that night. She had been in her room, trying to calm the kids after another argument, when the lock on her door snapped. Her husband burst in, not shouting this time, but breathing like someone who had crossed a line he couldn't walk back from. She tried to shield the children, but he grabbed her and pushed her against the wall, threatening her in a way that left no room for doubt. The kids saw everything, and their screams only fueled his rage. When he turned his back for just a few seconds, she grabbed all 3 children and bolted out the back door without shoes, without coats, without even thinking of the storm outside. She just knew they had to run before he made good on his threat. Once she reached the road, she remembered what he owned. A truck, the kind that could tear through snow like nothing. And guns he kept loaded in the garage. She knew he wouldn't stop. She knew he was still out there, somewhere behind them in all that white. Marcus listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening as pieces of the story clicked together in ways Evelyn didn't notice. She kept shaking, repeating that she didn't know where her husband was now, only that he had the means and the rage to track them through a storm no one else would dare drive in. She looked toward the back window again, her breath catching every time the wind made the glass tremble. What she didn't know was that Marcus recognized the description of the man she was terrified of. He knew the type of threats that man made. He knew the kind of violence he was capable of. And he knew it because their paths had crossed before. Long before this night. Long before this storm. Long before Evelyn ever realized her life would collide with his. Marcus drove with both hands gripping the wheel, guiding the truck along a narrow forest road he knew by memory alone. The storm swallowed everything around them, but he kept his voice steady, telling Evelyn they were only a few minutes from his cabin. She nodded, but kept her arms around Jake, as if letting go for even a moment might undo the fragile progress they'd made. When they finally reached the cabin, Marcus carried Jake inside, his body still cold but warming under the thick blankets by the fireplace. The twins sat close to the flames, their shivers slowly easing as Marcus handed them warm tea he'd made almost without thinking, like muscle memory from a life he tried not to revisit. Evelyn stood in the doorway, unsure whether to sit or run. Her fear still wrapped tightly around her. But as Jake's breathing steadied under the glow of the fire, something in her broke loose. She slid to the floor beside the couch, her hands covering her face, whispering that she didn't trust anyone anymore, not after the things she'd endured behind closed doors that no one believed. Her words came out in fragments, like she was apologizing for being afraid, apologizing for existing in someone else's anger for too long. Marcus paused, sensing that silence would hurt more than anything he could say. He sat beside her, not touching her, just close enough for her to feel she wasn't alone in the room anymore. He told her that trust didn't return just because a door closed behind you. He understood that better than most people realized. Then, for the first time in years, he shared a part of himself he always kept hidden. He told her he had once had a family, a wife and son, a life filled with noise and warmth. He told her that when he was away on duty, a house accident took them both before he could get home. He didn't go into detail. He didn't have to. His voice was enough. Evelyn watched him closely, seeing the grief he carried like a shadow he never shook off. He admitted he blamed himself, that he replayed every moment, wondering what he could have changed. That loss drove him into the mountains, into isolation, into a life where he didn't have to explain why he didn't celebrate holidays, or why certain memories left him quiet for long stretches. For the first time since they met on that frozen highway, Evelyn's expression softened. Not with trust, not fully, but with a recognition that the man sitting in front of her was safe, yet wounded in ways that mirrored her own scars. She whispered that she was sorry for his loss, and her voice held a gentleness he hadn't heard from anyone in years. Across the room, The twins began whispering, their little hands clutching crayons Marcus kept in a drawer for the rare times neighbors brought their kids to visit. Lily and Rose huddled together on the floor, drawing a picture with uneven lines and bright colors, their faces calmer than before. When they held it up, Evelyn looked confused at first, then emotional. The twins had drawn Marcus standing beside a fire, holding Jake safely, with themselves smiling next to him. They had written one shaky word at the top. Marcus didn't quite know how to react to the drawing the twins had made, but the faint smile they gave him lingered in the room like a brief reminder that safety was possible. For a few minutes, the cabin felt warmer than the fire alone could explain. Jake slept with steady breaths. Evelyn rested her head against the arm of the couch, exhaustion finally loosening its grip, and the twins leaned against each other, fighting sleep but comforted by the quiet. Then, without warning, the faint outline of headlights swept across the cabin wall. Marcus's entire body stiffened. He rose slowly, motioning Evelyn to stay still as he stepped toward the window. Outside, cutting through the storm, a truck idled in the driveway. A man was walking around the cabin, his footsteps crunching through the iced snow, deliberate and slow. Marcus's breath caught as the headlights shifted enough for the license plate to become visible. It wasn't just familiar, it was unmistakable. He turned toward Evelyn, his voice low and strained with a familiarity she wasn't expecting. He asked her if her husband's name was Daniel Parker. The way Evelyn froze told him everything before she even spoke. She didn't need to answer. Her silence confirmed what he already feared, and the terror in her eyes told him she knew exactly who had arrived. Marcus stepped closer, his voice lower than before, explaining something he had hoped he'd never have to say out loud. He told her he knew Daniel, not from this town, not from a casual encounter, but from years ago when they served together. He said Daniel had always struggled with violent impulses, even in controlled environments, and that Marcus had once saved his life during a mission that went wrong. But instead of gratitude, Daniel spiraled into unpredictability afterward, the kind that blurred the line between ally and threat. Marcus explained that he had been forced to file a report after Daniel endangered their team, a report that nearly ended Daniel's military career. Daniel had sworn he would get even. Evelyn's hands shook as she tried to process what she was hearing, realizing the man who had chased her into the storm wasn't simply a husband who snapped in anger. This wasn't a sudden explosion. It was something he had been capable of for a long time. She whispered that Daniel didn't just lose control that night. He planned what he wanted to do. And if he had planned this much, then he also had time to prepare for more. Marcus looked back at the window, watching the shadow move around the cabin with calm, calculated steps. The realization settled over both of them with a cold that cut deeper than the storm outside. If Daniel was here, moving with confidence instead of desperation, it meant one terrifying thing. He wasn't alone. The cabin had fallen into a silence so fragile that even the crackle of the fire felt too loud. Marcus watched Daniel's shadow shift outside, circling with a slow certainty that made every instinct in him sharpen. Before he could say anything else, the storm surged with a violent burst of wind that slammed against the roof. The lights flickered once, then vanished. The cabin sank into total darkness. The twins screamed. Evelyn grabbed them instinctively, and Jake jolted awake in confusion, gasping as the room disappeared around him. Marcus moved quickly, guiding them away from the windows, whispering that they were safe, even though he knew safety was slipping through their fingers. He reached for the drawer where he kept an old hunting rifle, one he hadn't touched in years because he hated the memories attached to it. Evelyn's breath trembled in the dark. She whispered that Daniel was going to kill them, and every word carried a fear she had been running from for far too long. The first pounding on the door cracked through the darkness like thunder. Daniel's voice followed, calm and cold, calling Evelyn's name as if he were asking her to come in for dinner. Marcus positioned himself between the family and the door while Evelyn clutched the children, her entire body shaking. Another hit splintered the wood, then another, until the hinges groaned under the pressure. Marcus shouted for Evelyn to move farther back, and the moment she did, the door burst inward with a violent shove. Daniel stumbled inside, covered in snow, his eyes wide with the kind of fury Marcus remembered all too well. They collided immediately, Marcus trying to shove him back outside, Daniel swinging with enough force to knock the rifle from Marcus's hands. The struggle crashed into the furniture, sending sparks from the fireplace shooting upward. Evelyn screamed for Marcus to stop fighting, terrified he would be killed before she could do anything. Daniel slammed Marcus into the wall, and Marcus felt something tear sharply along his side, a pain so sudden it stole his breath. Still, he pushed Daniel away, desperate to keep him from reaching the children. The injury weakened Marcus's grip, and Daniel finally threw him to the ground, leaving him gasping. The twins cried out for him, but Daniel ignored them, stepping forward with a chilling focus as he reached for the handgun tucked in his jacket. Evelyn froze, watching the man she once married point a weapon at the man who had protected her children without hesitation. Marcus forced himself upright, despite the pain, shouting for Evelyn to take the kids and run. But she didn't move. Something in her shifted. All the years of fear, the nights of walking on eggshells, the guilt, the shame, it all surged forward. But for the first time, it didn't crush her. It sharpened her. Daniel aimed the gun at Marcus, whispering that he should have minded his own business. Evelyn looked at her children, at Marcus bleeding on the floor, at the man she once promised to love, and she realized she wasn't that frightened woman anymore. She wasn't running. Not this time. With trembling hands, she picked up the fallen rifle. Her voice shook as she told Daniel to stop, but he only turned toward her, lifting his gun. For a split second, Marcus thought he would watch history repeat itself, a tragedy he couldn't stop. But Evelyn did something she had never done in all the years she lived under Daniel's shadow. She chose to protect herself. She chose to protect her children. She made the decision she never believed she had enough strength to make. For a long moment, the cabin was silent except for the storm outside and the ragged breaths filling the room. Daniel lay motionless on the floor, the weapon kicked far out of reach, and Evelyn stood frozen with the rifle still trembling in her hands. Marcus, bleeding and barely able to stay upright, spoke her name softly until she finally lowered the gun. The moment she let it fall, she collapsed beside her children, pulling them close as they cried into her shoulders. Marcus staggered toward them, but before he could speak, distant sirens broke through the wind. The deputies arrived minutes later, rushing inside with flashlights raised, but the moment the twins saw them, they ran straight back to Marcus instead, clinging to him, sobbing so hard their small bodies shook. Evelyn's voice was unsteady as she tried to thank him, her hands shaking as she touched the blood on his shirt. Marcus smiled faintly through the pain, whispering that she was the one who kept her children alive. He only helped her realize the strength she already had. Outside, the storm softened while paramedics tended to Marcus's injury. Evelyn knelt beside him, refusing to let go of his hand even as the officers asked her questions. She told him she didn't want him disappearing after this, not into the mountains, not into silence again. Her voice broke when she said the kids trusted him, and she did too. in a way she never expected. Marcus met her eyes, and for the first time in years, he let someone see the part of him that wasn't trying to stay distant. There were no promises, no sudden transformations, just a quiet understanding that healing, for both of them, might begin sooner than either believed possible. As the ambulance doors closed, the twins waved at him through tears, and Evelyn leaned closer, whispering that he had changed their lives long before the sun came up over that frozen road. In a world where danger often looks familiar and safety looks like a stranger, sometimes the person you fear is the one sent to save you. What do you think Evelyn should do next? Stay in town or start a new life somewhere safe? If this story touched your heart, hit like so more people see it, and subscribe for more gripping stories every week.